In the mountains of western Mexico, where mist rolls over pine-covered hills at dawn and narrow roads cut through small farming villages, a boy was growing up in poverty. Few outside his community would ever know his name then. Fewer still could imagine that one day it would appear in intelligence briefings in Washington, dominate security meetings in Mexico City, and become synonymous with one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. That boy was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The world knows him as El Mencho. For more than a decade, he has been one of the most wanted fugitives alive, the alleged leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. In less than 2 decades, this organization evolved from a regional enforcement group into a transnational trafficking powerhouse with influence stretching from rural Mexican states to major American cities and international markets. Recently, new developments have once again pulled his story back into the spotlight. Intensified crackdowns, financial sanctions, major indictments, and arrests of key figures connected to his network. But to understand why his name continues to surface in global headlines, we have to go back to the beginning, because El Mencho did not rise overnight. His ascent was gradual, strategic, and deeply tied to the shifting landscape of organized crime in Mexico. Born in the 1960s in rural Jalisco, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes grew up in a region where economic opportunity was limited. Agriculture sustained families, but barely. For many young men in that era, the path forward was narrow: remain in subsistence farming, migrate north to the United States, or become involved in the growing drug trade that had begun reshaping entire communities. As a teenager, he migrated north. Like millions of others, he crossed into California seeking work. But the reality of undocumented life in the United States often meant instability and vulnerability. During the 1980s, he was arrested on drug-related charges and later deported back to Mexico. That deportation would mark a turning point. Returning to Mexico in the late 1980s and early 1990s meant entering a country where the drug trade was consolidating power. Large organizations dominated trafficking routes into the United States. The Sinaloa cartel was already an established force operating through complex alliances and long-standing networks. Cartel structures were hierarchical, and while violence existed, it was often calculated and directed. But this structure would not remain stable. By the early 2000s, the Mexican government, under growing pressure from the United States, began aggressively targeting cartel leadership. High-profile arrests and extraditions disrupted long-standing hierarchies. The intention was clear: dismantle criminal empires by removing their leaders. Instead, fragmentation followed. Splinter groups emerged, alliances collapsed. New rivalries intensified, violence escalated sharply across multiple states. It was in this environment of fragmentation that El Mencho began solidifying his position. He aligned himself with the Milenio Cartel, a smaller but influential trafficking group with operations centered in Jalisco and connections extending beyond. Through strategic relationships, including marriage into a family with cartel ties, he expanded his influence within the organization. He reportedly gained experience in logistics, enforcement, and coordination, learning how routes were managed, how money was moved, and how loyalty was enforced. When authorities arrested key Milenio leaders around 2010, the organization fractured under pressure. Many observers assumed it would dissolve completely. Instead, from its remnants, a new force emerged: the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Initially, CJNG did not appear to be a dominant player. In early messaging, the group portrayed itself as a vigilante force standing against rival cartels accused of brutality. Videos circulated online claiming they sought to restore order to Jalisco by confronting competing organizations. But the vigilante narrative quickly gave way to a far more aggressive strategy. Under El Mencho's leadership, CJNG expanded with remarkable speed. Unlike older cartels that often relied heavily on discreet bribery and negotiated influence, CJNG demonstrated a willingness to deploy overt force and public displays of power. Convoys of armored vehicles appeared in rural areas. Coordinated gunmen in tactical gear surfaced in propaganda footage. Sophisticated weaponry signaled a shift toward paramilitary-style operations. Their objective was not merely to survive, it was to dominate. CJNG pursued control of strategic ports along Mexico's Pacific coast, key border crossings into the United States, and internal trafficking corridors connecting production zones to export points. They expanded into urban centers while simultaneously securing rural strongholds ideal for clandestine drug production. Then, in 2015, an incident marked a dramatic escalation. During a large-scale security operation in Jalisco aimed at capturing El Mencho, cartel operatives launched coordinated attacks across the state. Highways were blocked with burning vehicles. Businesses were set ablaze. Entire cities were paralyzed. In one of the most shocking moments, cartel gunmen used heavy weaponry to bring down a Mexican military helicopter during the operation. The message was unmistakable. This was an organization willing to confront the state directly. The capture attempt failed. El Mencho escaped. The legend grew. From that point forward, he became not only a fugitive but a symbol of resilience within criminal networks. While other high-profile cartel leaders were captured or extradited, he remained at large. U.S. authorities issued indictments accusing him of overseeing large-scale trafficking operations. Financial sanctions targeted businesses allegedly linked to his network. A multimillion-dollar reward was offered for information leading to his capture, yet he remained elusive. Unlike some predecessors who embraced public visibility, El Mencho maintained a low profile. No flamboyant interviews, no public appearances, no confirmed photographs in recent years. Intelligence reports suggested he insulated himself behind layers of loyal intermediaries, often family members or long-trusted associates. That insulation strategy became critical as authorities began arresting individuals within his inner circle. Sons, daughters, relatives, and senior lieutenants were detained over the years. Each arrest was described as a significant blow to CJNG's structure. Yet the organization continued expanding. Part of that expansion coincided with a major transformation in global drug markets. While cocaine and marijuana had long been staples of cartel revenue, synthetic drugs began reshaping the landscape. Methamphetamine production surged. Synthetic opioid trafficking expanded rapidly, particularly fentanyl, a substance far more potent than heroin and cheaper to produce. CJNG adapted quickly. Synthetic drug production required access to chemical precursors, laboratory infrastructure, and distribution networks rather than large agricultural fields. This allowed for scalable production with high-profit margins. Authorities in both Mexico and the United States alleged that CJNG became a central player in supplying synthetic drugs to international markets. As overdose deaths climbed in the United States, political pressure mounted. Washington intensified demands for stronger enforcement. Additional indictments named El Mencho as a central coordinator in transnational trafficking operations. Cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities deepened, at least publicly. Despite this pressure, CJNG demonstrated resilience. Analysts point to its decentralized operational structure as one reason. Regional commanders reportedly maintained significant autonomy while remaining aligned with central leadership. This model reduces vulnerability to single-point failures. If one cell is dismantled, others continue operating. At the same time, violence associated with cartel conflicts intensified in multiple regions. Territorial disputes between CJNG and rival organizations contributed to instability in several Mexican states. Communities found themselves caught between armed groups and security forces, navigating a daily reality shaped by fear, economic dependence, and limited institutional protection. The so-called kingpin strategy, targeting cartel leaders with the expectation that organizations will collapse, has produced mixed outcomes. In some cases, leadership removal fractured groups into smaller factions that fought violently for succession. In others, organizations adapted and continued operating under new management. CJNG itself emerged from fragmentation following leadership arrests within the Milenio Cartel. That history complicates the question: if El Mencho is eventually captured or killed, will the organization dissolve or evolve again? Recent developments suggest intensifying pressure. High-profile seizures of synthetic drugs, arrests of financial operators, increased surveillance of trafficking routes, public statements from officials emphasizing renewed focus on dismantling CJNG infrastructure. Yet, capturing a leader who has evaded authorities for years is not simply a matter of issuing warrants. Geography, corruption, local support networks, and sophisticated counterintelligence measures complicate operations. Reports over the years have suggested that El Mencho suffers from health issues, though these claims remain difficult to independently verify. Rumors periodically circulate about his location, movements, or condition. But confirmed details are scarce. That scarcity fuels mythology. In the world of organized crime, myth can be a force multiplier. The less visible a leader is, the more speculation fills the void. Stories of narrow escapes and survival against overwhelming odds strengthen reputational power within criminal networks. But beyond the mythology lies a more sobering reality. The story of El Mencho is not just about one fugitive. It is about structural conditions, poverty, corruption, global drug demand, fragmented institutions that enable organized crime to regenerate even after major disruptions. Communities in areas where CJNG operates often face complex choices. Some residents rely indirectly on illicit economies for income. Others endure intimidation or violence. The state's presence may be intermittent or contested. In such environments, criminal organizations can embed themselves deeply. As international pressure grows and enforcement efforts intensify, uncertainty looms. Will sustained targeting of financial networks weaken CJNG more effectively than past leadership-focused strategies? Will internal fractures emerge under pressure? Or has the organization reached a level of institutional maturity that allows it to survive even without its founding leader? For now, one fact remains undeniable. Despite years at the top of international most wanted lists, despite multimillion-dollar rewards and coordinated multinational efforts, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes remains at large. His story is still unfolding. And the outcome, whether capture, succession, fragmentation, or transformation, will shape not only the future of CJNG, but the broader trajectory of organized crime in Mexico and its impact far beyond its borders. By the mid-2010s, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel was no longer a regional force testing its strength. It was a rapidly expanding empire. What made its growth so striking was not just speed, but method. CJNG pursued expansion like a modern corporation entering new markets, aggressively, strategically, and with overwhelming force when necessary. At the center was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, operating from the shadows. Traditional cartels often expanded through alliances or truces. CJNG frequently chose a different approach: shock and dominance. Sudden surges of armed convoys, coordinated attacks, targeted assassinations, and public displays of strength sent an unmistakable message. The organization demonstrated a willingness to escalate quickly. In states like Michoacan, Guanajuato, Veracruz, and Zacatecas, confrontations intensified. Some groups resisted, others aligned for survival. The result was a map of Mexico increasingly marked by shifting conflict zones. But behind the violence was a calculated economic objective. Territory meant roots, roots meant revenue, and revenue meant power. One of CJNG's most strategic priorities was access to Pacific ports capable of receiving shipments of chemical precursors. Methamphetamine production was a major revenue stream. CJNG expanded laboratory capacity, investing in rural sites that could be relocated quickly. Control over key ports allowed importation of chemical components. These were transported inland to hidden labs, converted, and trafficked north. Unlike plant-based drugs, synthetic production was not dependent on harvest cycles. It was industrial, scalable, and extraordinarily profitable. Authorities alleged CJNG became a central player in fentanyl trafficking, a synthetic opioid far more potent than heroin. Its potency meant smaller quantities generated massive profit margins, but also devastating public health consequences. As overdose deaths surged in the United States, political pressure intensified. CJNG transformed into an international crisis point. CJNG's expansion inevitably triggered confrontation with established powers. The Sinaloa cartel had deep-rooted networks. Territorial overlap often resulted in violence. Not all battles were against large national rivals, but also smaller local groups. These groups often knew the terrain better, had local political connections, and were willing to fight to maintain control. The consequences were brutal. Entire towns became battlegrounds. Roadways were blocked by burning vehicles during clashes. Civilians were displaced as armed groups fought for dominance. Mass graves were discovered in areas previously considered peripheral. The violence was not random, it was territorial. And territory translated into logistical control. One of CJNG's most distinctive features was its use of visual propaganda. Videos surfaced online showing armored vehicles, gunmen in tactical gear carrying high-caliber rifles, and carefully arranged displays of seized weaponry. In some cases, armed men read scripted messages identifying themselves as CJNG, pledging loyalty to Mencho, and threatening rivals. These videos projected strength to competitors, signaled discipline to recruits, and reinforced the perception of a paramilitary force. Perception, in organized crime, is power. If rivals believe you are stronger, they may retreat without a fight. If communities believe resistance is futile, cooperation becomes more likely. CJNG cultivated a brand rooted in intimidation and calculated messaging. Mexican authorities responded with increased military deployments in contested regions. Joint operations sought to dismantle labs and arrest commanders. But enforcement faced structural challenges. Geography complicated operations. Mountainous terrain provided concealment. Rural communities were difficult to monitor. Corruption allegations within local institutions sometimes undermined efforts. Moreover, targeting leadership figures often produced unintended consequences. Succession struggles sometimes triggered internal violence. Decentralized cells simply continued operations. The Kingpin's strategy had produced mixed outcomes. CJNG appeared to have learned from the mistakes of others. Rather than concentrating knowledge in one or two leaders, they distributed authority. This made total dismantlement more complex. As U.S. authorities tracked rising synthetic drug flows, federal indictments named Mencho. American agencies described CJNG as one of the most dangerous transnational criminal organizations. Sanctions targeted businesses. Financial investigations sought to trace money laundering schemes. International cooperation expanded beyond North America. The bounty for information leading to Mencho's capture climbed into the millions of dollars. Yet, he remained out of reach. Unlike earlier cartel figures, he appeared to avoid visibility. No confirmed interviews, no verified public appearances. Intelligence assessments suggested he relied on trusted family members and loyal intermediaries to buffer him from direct exposure. This invisibility strengthened his mystique, and mystique strengthened his authority. In territories where CJNG secured control, the relationship with local communities was complex. Some residents described coercion and fear. Businesses pressured into paying extortion fees, farmers caught between rival factions, families displaced by violence. Others described a different reality: illicit employment opportunities, financial assistance, or informal enforcement against petty crime. Criminal organizations often seek legitimacy where state presence is weak. They can embed themselves socially. This dual dynamic, fear and dependence, complicates enforcement. Communities may hesitate to cooperate with authorities. Analysts point to CJNG's internal discipline as a factor in its rapid growth. Reports suggest strict codes of conduct, harsh punishment for betrayal, and tight operational security. Communication channels are reportedly compartmentalized. The organization's resilience under pressure suggests a degree of structural sophistication. Arrests of family members tested that structure. Some observers speculated that detaining relatives might fracture internal loyalty. Yet CJNG continued to operate across multiple states, maintaining trafficking flows and territorial influence. This resilience reinforced a central question: is CJNG dependent on one man? Or has it evolved into an institution capable of surviving beyond him? As CJNG expanded, violence in contested regions often spiked. Security analysts noted that expansionist cartels frequently produce higher short-term violence levels. When two groups contest the same route, conflict becomes more likely. In several Mexican states, homicide rates rose sharply. Civilians bore the consequences: displacement, business closures, disrupted schooling, and long-term trauma. Beyond Mexico's borders, synthetic drug trafficking contributed to public health crises abroad. The profits fueling expansion were tied to devastating human impact. This reality complicates narratives that frame cartel growth purely in terms of power dynamics. Behind every shipment seized or route contested lies a network of communities affected by addiction, violence, or economic instability. By the early 2020s, CJNG had established a presence in a majority of Mexican states. Its national footprint was undeniable. International agencies labeled it a top enforcement priority. Mexican security forces increased operational focus. Political leaders faced growing pressure to demonstrate measurable progress. Yet, dismantling a transnational criminal organization is not a single event. It is a sustained campaign. As Part 2 closes, the situation stands at a crossroads. CJNG has demonstrated adaptability, strategic aggression, and organizational resilience. El Mencho remains at large. Pressure from international and domestic authorities continues to mount. The next phase will involve deeper geopolitical tension, shifting political strategies, and the broader question of how nations confront criminal enterprises that operate like multinational corporations. The financial front. A significant change in strategy happened not on a battlefield, but in bank records. For decades, enforcement focused on drugs and weapons. Labs were dismantled, shipments intercepted, gunmen arrested. But synthetic drug networks proved remarkably adaptable. Destroy one lab, another appeared. Seize one convoy, two more slipped through. Authorities expanded the battlefield. Financial intelligence units in Mexico and the U.S. began mapping business fronts. Construction firms, agricultural enterprises, real estate, transportation. Layers of economic activity masking laundering operations. Sanctions were imposed, accounts frozen, properties seized. The aim: disrupt revenue and erode trust. When money becomes difficult to move, loyalty becomes harder to buy. Loyalty is the glue that holds criminal empires together. The arrests that sent signals, high-profile arrests followed. Relatives of El Mencho were detained. Some analysts saw these arrests as symbolic pressure points. Others, deeper penetration into CJNG's core. The synthetic drug crisis escalates. The crisis deepened across North America. Fentanyl and methamphetamine seizures reached record levels. CJNG was repeatedly named in indictments alleging large-scale fentanyl trafficking. Networks spanned multiple states. Distribution cells embedded in major metropolitan areas, supply chains traced back to Mexican production hubs. The crisis reframed the narrative. This was no longer just a Mexican security issue. It was a transnational emergency. Diplomatic conversations between Mexico and the United States included pointed discussions about enforcement and intelligence sharing. The pressure was no longer subtle, it was public. Territorial flashpoints. Inside Mexico, violence patterns offered clues about internal stress. Clashes between CJNG and rival factions intensified. Unexpected fractures appeared, splinter groups claiming autonomy. Former allies turning adversaries, local commanders asserting independence. Criminal organizations often project unity outward. When pressure mounts, cracks can widen. Reports described shifting alliances, targeted assassinations, and sudden leadership changes. Whether these represented coordinated restructuring or instability remained unclear. But one thing was evident: the environment was volatile. Health rumors and strategic silence. For years, rumors circulated about El Mencho's health. Unverified reports claimed chronic illness, limited mobility. Some speculated he rarely left fortified rural hideouts, but rumors serve purposes in criminal ecosystems. If rivals believe a leader is weakened, they may test boundaries. If authorities believe he is vulnerable, they may intensify operations. Strategic silence can be powerful. By remaining unseen and rarely heard, El Mencho maintained ambiguity. Ambiguity preserved leverage. Yet, ambiguity cannot shield against sustained intelligence campaigns forever. A shift in Mexican policy. Mexico's security strategy has evolved across administrations. Debates over militarization, social investment, and enforcement intensity shaped how the state confronts organized crime. Critics argue past captures led to violent fragmentation. Supporters counter that unchecked organizations only strengthen. Operations targeting CJNG infrastructure appeared increasingly coordinated, not only leadership-focused, but network-focused. Chemical shipments intercepted at ports, laboratories dismantled in rural zones. Financial facilitators arrested in urban centers, each move incremental. each designed to degrade capacity rather than produce a single dramatic headline. The question of succession. As pressure builds around any long-standing leader, a critical question emerges. Who comes next? CJNG's structure, layered and regionally distributed, suggests contingency planning. Major organizations rarely hinge on one individual, but succession in criminal networks is rarely smooth. Power transitions can trigger internal violence. If El Mencho were captured, would CJNG fracture? Would regional commanders compete? Or has the organization matured? Security analysts remain divided. History offers conflicting lessons. International spotlight, global attention has intensified. Media coverage frames CJNG as a dominant criminal organization. International agencies collaborate more closely. Intelligence exchanges occur across borders at unprecedented levels. Sanctions now extend beyond individuals to networks of associates and shell companies. Investigative journalism exposes alleged ties. Visibility is a double-edged sword. It increases scrutiny, but can also harden resolve within the organization. Communities in the crossfire. While governments calculate strategy, communities remain caught in the middle. In some regions, residents report reduced open confrontation. In others, violence flares unpredictably. Eradicating a cartel requires more than arrests. It requires alternative economic pathways, institutional trust, and long-term governance stability. Without those, vacuums can reemerge, and new actors can rise. CJNG itself was born from such a vacuum. Is the net truly tightening? The pursuit of El Mencho has spanned years, administrations, and international strategies. The difference now lies in the breadth of pressure: financial, digital, diplomatic, operational. Rather than a singular manhunt, the approach increasingly resembles systemic dismantlement. But dismantling a system built on decentralized cells, diversified revenue, and transnational logistics is complex. Capture remains a possibility, so does prolonged evasion. And in rare scenarios, negotiated surrender. For now, what is clear is this: the margins for error are shrinking. The scrutiny is intensifying. The consequences are escalating. For more than a decade, the name Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes has represented both a target and a symbol. A target for international law enforcement. A symbol of how organized crime evolves faster than systems designed to stop it. As pressure intensifies around the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the world is left with a defining question: what happens if the man at the center of it all finally falls? History shows a cartel leader's capture is never just an ending. Sometimes it's an ignition point. Scenario 1. Capture. If El Mencho is captured alive, the immediate impact would be seismic. Politically, it would be framed as a landmark victory. Years of intelligence coordination, financial tracing, and operational planning culminating in one decisive moment. International headlines would dominate for weeks. Diplomatic conversations between Mexico and the United States would shift towards celebration. But beyond symbolism lies structure. CJNG today is not the small, tightly clustered group it was at its inception. It is geographically dispersed, operationally layered, and financially diversified. Regional commanders oversee territory. Logistics managers handle trafficking corridors. Financial operators maintain laundering pipelines. In theory, the organization could continue functioning, but capture creates vulnerability. Leadership transitions test loyalty. Rival factions may attempt to exploit perceived weakness. External competitors, including remnants of groups like the Sinaloa Cartel, could probe contested territories. Short-term instability would be almost guaranteed. Fragmentation or consolidation depends on succession planning, largely invisible to the public. Scenario 2, fragmentation. History offers cautionary lessons. When major cartel leaders were captured, organizations sometimes splintered into smaller, more volatile factions. These factions often fought each other for dominance, increasing localized violence. If CJNG fractured into regional blocs, Mexico could see a temporary surge in territorial battles. Smaller groups might prioritize rapid revenue generation over centralized discipline. Extortion, kidnapping, and fuel theft could spike. Paradoxically, a weakened central authority can lead to more unpredictable violence. For communities already living under cartel influence, fragmentation can be more destabilizing than monopoly control. Multiple armed actors competing for the same territory often generate higher civilian risk. The end of one dominant figure does not necessarily mean the end of organized crime, only its mutation. Scenario 3. Institutional survival. There is another possibility. CJNG may have evolved beyond dependence on a single individual. Over the years, analysts have observed signs of bureaucratic development within the organization. Semi-autonomous cells, diversified revenue streams, internal discipline mechanisms, and operational redundancy. If that structure is strong enough, leadership replacement could be swift and controlled. In this scenario, the organization absorbs the shock, rebrands strategically, and continues operating with minimal visible disruption. From a law enforcement perspective, this would represent the most challenging outcome, proof that kingpin-focused strategies are insufficient. The political stakes, the pursuit of El Mencho, is not occurring in a vacuum. Mexico's security strategy remains a subject of intense debate domestically. Balancing militarized enforcement with social investment has proven complex. Public fatigue with violence coexists with skepticism about purely force-driven approaches. Meanwhile, in the United States, the synthetic drug crisis continues shaping policy conversations. Fentanyl seizures and overdose statistics fuel calls for stronger action against trafficking networks. CJNG has repeatedly been cited in American indictments tied to synthetic drug distribution. This dynamic creates diplomatic tension. Cooperation is essential, but political narratives differ. Success or failure in capturing high-profile figures influences not just security policy, but electoral politics and bilateral relations. The economic underlayer, beyond arrests and raids, lies a deeper question. Why does the system regenerate? Organized crime flourishes where economic opportunity is scarce and institutional trust is weak. In regions where legitimate employment options are limited, illicit economies can become embedded. Dismantling a cartel's leadership without addressing the economic ecosystems surrounding it risks repetition. Ports will still receive cargo. Demand for synthetic drugs will persist internationally. Smuggling corridors will remain geographically viable. Unless alternative structures replace illicit ones, power gaps will attract new actors. The story of CJNG itself began in such a gap, the evolution of criminal enterprises. One of the defining features of the 21st century criminal landscape is adaptability. Cartels now operate with multinational supply chains, digital communications, financial engineering tactics, and diversified portfolios that extend beyond narcotics into fuel theft, illegal mining, and other revenue streams. They study enforcement patterns. They adjust logistics. They invest in counter-surveillance. The battle is no longer solely about firepower. It is about information. In that sense, the pursuit of El Mencho reflects a broader transformation in global crime dynamics. The question is no longer whether a leader can be located physically, but whether the network sustaining him can be systematically dismantled. The human dimension. Amid strategic analysis, it is easy to lose sight of the human toll. Communities displaced by conflict, families affected by addiction crises abroad, small business owners navigating extortion threats, young recruits drawn into criminal structures by limited alternatives. The impact radiates far beyond leadership figures. For many residents in contested territories, stability, even imperfect stability, can feel preferable to violent power struggles. That complicates public cooperation with authorities and underscores the importance of long-term governance reforms. Security is not solely about arrests. It is about trust, the final question. So, where does this leave us? As of now, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes remains at large. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel continues to face sustained pressure. Arrests and seizures accumulate. Financial networks are scrutinized. Intelligence coordination deepens, but criminal history teaches patience. Large organizations rarely collapse overnight. They bend, they fracture, they reorganize, or they endure. It reveals the limits of strategies focused solely on individuals. And it underscores the complexity of dismantling systems built on both fear and opportunity. In the end, the question is not only whether El Mencho will be captured, it is whether the conditions that enabled his rise will be transformed. Because if they are not, history suggests that another name, in another mountain village, may one day step into the vacuum. And the cycle will begin again. End of series.